Good morning, my friends. It's actually noon. Hello, my friends, it's Nina, and I am currently barefaced. As you can tell by the title of this video, I am doing a get ready with me. I'm going to do my makeup with you guys because I'm going to be talking about a certain topic, and I need to be doing stuff with my hands, so I'm doing my makeup. So I was sick for like 16 hours. I don't know what that was. I thought I was actually sick. I had a sore throat and all that, so I thought I was actually sick, and I was really like shook. I thought I couldn't film a video, but you know, I took one day to rest. Then I'm fine now, so I don't know what happened. That was a weird experience, but I'm okay for now. My throat is kind of okay. My nose, I might sound a little different, but that's fine. But as you can tell by the title of this video, I am going to be doing a get ready with me as I talk about a certain topic. And I'm going to talk about a topic that I feel like is interesting for you guys and really just explains a lot about me. So I am Korean American. I was born in America, but ethnically my family is entirely from Korea. I was the first one born in America, and so Korean American. I also don't know what that is. I don't know if it's a pimple or if it's a mosquito bite. Whatever it is, I haven't touched it because I'm not dealing with it. I'm just gonna let it heal on its own, whatever it is. I don't know what you are, but you better leave soon. My makeup routine's actually really short, so I might finish my makeup before I even finish talking about my story. So don't mind that. Just if you're actually getting ready, just keep going. Anyway, so about being a Korean American, even though I'm the first to be born in America, I am a second generation Korean American. Now you're probably wondering how that works. Well, so I was born in America, which makes me culturally very American because that's all I've ever known. So my dad grew up in Korea. He was born there. But then when he was 9, he moved to the US with his family, with his mom and sister, and then started a life here. So he's considered the first generation or 1.5 generation because he was the one to really first experience transitioning to the American lifestyle and all that. So his story is definitely very different from mine because he was an actual immigrant who came to the US and had to deal with a lot. Anyway, he came here when he was still very young, so he was able to pick up the American culture. He had to pick it up really fast because obviously he needed to blend in with everyone else, and he was kind of like, he was the new kid, you know, there weren't a lot of Asians where he grew up. I don't think there were really any Koreans or Asians around him, but my dad definitely picked up the American culture very fast, and he can speak English perfectly. He speaks both Korean and English very perfectly. The first language he will speak is English. He'll speak Korean if he has to, but otherwise he'll just speak in English. He spent literally most of his life in America, so he's definitely very Americanized. Now moving on from that, my mom, she came to the US for college, so she spent her entire adolescence and youth in Korea. So culturally she's Korean, very Korean. I can't even tell if I finished my BB cream. The first language she'll speak is Korean. She's culturally very Korean. She only really cares about Korean media and entertainment and culture and all that. So the next thing that happened was me being born. I was the first of my entire family to be born in the US. I was born in California, specifically the Bay Area. So I was fortunate enough to be growing up in a place that is very diverse. We're very culturally diverse, and so I never experienced being the only Asian or the only Korean. I was literally surrounded by a lot of Asians and a lot of Koreans, so I never felt different in that sense. Where I grew up, specifically in my city, there were a lot of Asians, so I didn't experience that much racism. It was mostly chill because if you were a racist, you would get attacked. So that was good. I didn't go to preschool. I spent most of my life at home with my family, my mom, my dad, and my brother. My one brother, because my other brother was born 14 years after me, so it was first my younger brother, so we were all just together. So my childhood before school really was surrounded by my parents, and so I was exposed to both Korean and English, which honestly got confusing and really affected the way that I grew up. Because I was having two languages spoken to me at the same time, it did affect the way that I developed language-wise. So because I didn't go to preschool, I kind of missed out on that first year or two of socializing with other kids. When I first went to kindergarten, I actually didn't understand the concept of going to school. I honestly didn't know what it was. So when my parents dropped me off on the first day, I remember leaving the classroom with them because I was like, where are they going? Why are they leaving me here? So I was like following them, but then my parents were like, no, you gotta stay here. And I was like, what is this? But yeah, so kindergarten was my first exposure to other kids. I was always surrounded by, you know, like my mom's friends' children, but other than that, this was the first time I really had to be in like a social environment, so it was terrifying. Anyway, moving on. When I was in school for the first few years, I experienced sort of being behind most of my peers, and that was an obvious thing because I didn't go to preschool, so I already was behind socially, but also education-wise, I was also behind my peers because I had both English and Korean in my head that I didn't pick up either language well. So I couldn't speak English that well. I obviously didn't know how to read that well, all that kind of stuff, so I was obviously behind my peers, and I was eventually put into an ELD program. Even though my first language was technically never Korean. Never. I never learned Korean and then forgot it like most people. No, it was never my first language or anything like that. So I was just literally developing slowly just because it was confusing. So I was put into ELD, which really kind of took a toll on my confidence in school. I already felt very behind my peers, and it was kind of, you know, just like a feeling of kind of embarrassment and shame that, you know, why am I so behind already? And I was like freaking what, 5, you know? Give me a break. But I was put into ELD, but I left the program so fast too. It was my first year of, you know, being in a social environment, so I needed time to adjust. I had experiences in the past where, you know, I would experience kids being mean about me not being so smart or not so, you know, quick. I actually had this one kid make fun of me for being a slow reader, and I was like, looking back, I was like, we're in first grade. What do you expect from me? But there were lots of moments like that that just kind of really affected my self-confidence. So growing up, for me, I became more and more distant from my Korean identity just because as I got older, you know, I was going through a lot of physical changes, and I just physically didn't look Korean, or I didn't fit in that well with my peers. I was tall, or at least bigger than most Koreans, and so I already felt this kind of physical insecurity that I didn't look Korean. And I also, as I was growing up, because my dad spoke English in the house and because I only went to American schools, I only picked up English. I didn't pick up Korean because I wasn't very involved in Korean communities growing up. I did have Korean friends growing up, and they were a huge part of my life, and they still kind of are, but they're all kind of doing their own things, as everyone really does after high school and all that. You know, I was mostly surrounded by Korean friends just because it was kind of like being with people who you can relate to. But as I got older, personally for me, my insecurities were getting a little too out of hand that it started affecting my relationships with not only just other people but also with myself. I was becoming more self-aware, as usually one does. You know, you start to really think about yourself as you grow up. I already carried this insecurity throughout most of my youth of being behind other people just because that's kind of how I grew up. I became more and more insecure about me not being able to speak Korean or, you know, understand Korean etiquette and culture and that kind of stuff. And more I would make mistakes that kind of really affected my self-esteem. You know, I went to Korean church and all that, but whenever I was part of these communities, I felt this personal detachment from everyone else just because I felt like, again, I wasn't blending in. I felt like I was lacking something. And when I was in these Korean communities, they would be able to speak to each other in Korean for fun. And I always felt kind of embarrassed that I couldn't participate like this. There was always this kind of, it was really more of like a personal insecurity that I just couldn't communicate, even though it really didn't matter that much because, you know, obviously they could speak English and it was just a thing that they were able to do. And obviously my upbringing was different than them, so. But because I wasn't very confident in myself already, it really took a toll on just how I felt about myself and just my identity and that kind of stuff. And communicating with Korean adults especially really affected my self-esteem because I wouldn't be able to communicate with them, and it really just felt embarrassing for me that I couldn't speak Korean. And I was just like, I just felt like they were judging me and like the way that I grew up, like, this Korean can't speak Korean, what is she? So it was always like a personal kind of feeling. I never really complained about it just because I didn't want to or feel like I needed to complain about it, but inside it was just disappointing for me that I couldn't participate like this, and you know, everyone else could blend in so easily between being an American and being Korean, and for me, I couldn't really identify with being Korean because I honestly couldn't relate to the culture or speak the language. So it really was just it was just frustrating, really. I was already a pretty socially anxious person, so this adding on to that kind of really just made knowing who I was really difficult. Eventually, this insecurity of not blending in with my peers really got to me, and I just kind of detached myself from these communities just because I already felt like I didn't belong, even though it really didn't have to go to that extent. It's just personally it got to a point where I kind of needed to leave because I didn't feel great about not being able to communicate my own language. Personally, I already felt physically different from other Koreans just because I have naturally curly hair, which is kind of strange for an East Asian, especially for a Korean. Wow, that's really bright. I honestly still don't know how I have curly, wavy hair. Physically, I already felt like I didn't belong, and then culturally, I obviously didn't belong in that sense. So I was just like, then what makes me a Korean? And so at that time, I really didn't understand the concept of it, so it really got to my self-confidence and my self-esteem because I really didn't know how to deal with it. So in high school, I was surrounded by a different social group because my friends were moving around, people were, you know, moving on, that kind of stuff. So naturally, I went to a new friend group, and my friend group was entirely not Korean just because that's how things turned out. Okay, see, so I already finished my makeup. Actually, I should do my mascara. So naturally, I just had this different friend group that was not Korean, and so I didn't really have that opportunity to be immersed in Korean culture just because there was really no tie to it other than obviously my parents and my family and all that. And nothing in my life really urged me to, you know, be connected to my Korean side. I was very much immersed in Western culture. You know, I was watching programs from the UK and stuff from America, American TV shows, that kind of stuff, obviously because I'm American, so that's what I was kind of into. I didn't pay much attention to Korean media at all. I wasn't watching Korean dramas or listening to K-pop or anything in high school, really, because that wasn't part of my social circle and my social environment. And so through that time, I was really just not emotionally connected to myself. I was really kind of living every single day just to get to the next day and eventually graduate, and you know, I was just having fun. I was very much still kind of insecure in high school, but at that point I wasn't letting it control my life or affect my life. I was living my life. And so in high school, I really didn't think about being Korean. It wasn't just like something I had to worry about. The crucial point in my journey of being Korean American really happened in my last year of high school and on from that. So there was a personal situation that affected my entire family and myself especially, and it was in my last year of high school when my great-grandma, who was a huge part of my family really, she was dealing with Alzheimer's and she was getting old and she was in the hospital. And why did I put mascara on? I probably should have put mascara on after this. This was really wrong timing. In the last part of 2014/2015, my great-grandma was in the hospital dealing with Alzheimer's. We only got to visit my grandma about once a year just because she lived in a different state. She lived in America. That's how my mom was able to come to the US, because my great-grandma also came. But my great-grandma was sick and she was dealing with Alzheimer's, so she already couldn't really remember who we were. And because we were only able to visit her once a year, we didn't know how she was doing. We didn't know that she got to this point. And so she was in the hospital, and this was the first time I was dealing with a family member being sick and at this stage in life. And it really was kind of surreal for me just because I didn't know how to deal with it, because throughout high school, you know, I didn't worry about this kind of stuff, even though, you know, obviously time was passing. And for me, it was just, it was something I couldn't comprehend. But when I visited her at the hospital, it started to hit me that, you know, she didn't remember us. And after being so careless about, not about myself, but you know, not really thinking about myself at a deeper level, suddenly it was all kind of hitting me at the same time that so much time passed and there was so much that I wanted to do that I didn't think about. Why did I wear mascara? So at this point, my grandma didn't really remember us that well. My great grandma, by the way, is my mom's grandma, so she was a very huge part of her life. You know, she basically raised her. My great grandma was a huge part of my life as well. When I was younger, I would look forward to her staying over with us, you know, even though there was this literal language barrier. She was a huge part of my childhood, and I would be excited whenever she would stay with us and when she would brush my hair every single morning, even though my hair, you're not really supposed to brush it like the way that she did. She didn't really understand that, you know, curly hair, you're not supposed to brush it with a certain brush, and she didn't really understand that, but she still did because she wanted to make my hair nice and pretty. And so there was that cultural difference that always made me kind of laugh as I got older, as I understood my hair more. But so she was a huge part of my life. But the thing that kind of really hit me when all this was happening was the fact that I realized I never really had a full conversation with her, nor do I even remember having a conversation with her. So this sort of guilt started, wow, okay, ooh, stop. So this sense of guilt was kind of just jumping out at me from nowhere because I didn't think about it. I kind of took it for granted. I always, for some reason, thought my grandma was just gonna be around for a long time. And this overwhelming sense of guilt kind of just came at me. And I was like, I really never had a conversation with her because she can't speak English, and I never bothered to speak with her in Korean because I couldn't. And so that was really when I started realizing. Literally, I don't know why I did my makeup. I should have just left my face bare. I also just felt helpless because at this point there was nothing I could do. She already didn't remember who we were. So it really was just a helpless time that, you know, there was nothing I could do at this point except be there for her as much as possible. And from then on, that's kind of when I took myself more seriously and really thought about how, you know, I can't really be distracted from myself anymore. I really should think more because things change so fast. So a few months later, my great grandma did pass away. That was kind of the end of that part of my life. So that's kind of when, you know, I became more self-reflexive and started really taking myself more seriously because I was really away from this part of me that, you know, I could have spent more time on. So it was just a very frustrating time because at the time too, I was still dealing with insecurities that I kind of pushed back. So moving on from that, I graduated high school. It was my last year of high school when this happened. So I was about to finish high school. So I finished high school, and this was when, you know, I finally was going to college, being independent, really learning a lot, being by myself, that kind of stuff. And because I was being more self-reflexive and because I was analyzing all my life a little bit more, this is kind of when the process happened of when I started becoming more aware of my background and everything. In college, I learned a whole lot more about, you know, the self and all that. I was taking a lot of psychology classes, sociology classes, all that kind of stuff, really just being more exposed to everything, and I was just becoming more educated about a person. So I was being more self-reflexive and more empathetic at this point, because before I didn't really care so much about these deeper things. You know, I was kind of just going through the motions, just trying to get through life, that I never really thought about people or myself or anything at a deeper sense. So in college I was becoming more aware of how, you know, people worked. Just to say, I'm not a psychology major, I'm not an expert at this kind of stuff, but I was definitely becoming more exposed to it. So my mom never really showed us how my great-grandma passing away affected her. I assumed she was heartbroken, because obviously if I was heartbroken, she would have been much more heartbroken. But I never really realized how much this affected her until she told me. As I got older, my parents would just talk to me about more things and, you know, relate to me on a personal level and that kind of stuff. And there was this one day when my mom told me how much, you know, how important my great-grandma was to her. And it was because my great-grandma, she spoke only Korean, you know, she was culturally very Korean. So this was kind of how my mom was able to connect to Korea and connect to her old family. And so when my great-grandma passed away, that kind of side of my mom just kind of vanished, and it just felt a little more lonely for her. And I never realized that, because I always kind of took her speaking English, being able to speak 2 languages, being able to switch from culture to culture, I took that for granted, and I didn't realize that it's still hard for her to understand American culture. Even though she's able to speak English, that doesn't mean she's part of the American culture. And so when my dad and I are speaking to each other, we can speak for a long time about anything because we actually understand the context and all that. But my mom, she sometimes doesn't understand that. It's just like how I'm not able to understand, or I wasn't able to understand, you know, Korean culture and etiquette. And I felt that shame and that embarrassment and that detachment, but I never pieced it together and saw my mom was experiencing the same thing, but kind of the other way around. And so at this point I realized that my mom too was very heavily affected by my great-grandma passing, and this kind of side to her was kind of gone, and she didn't really have someone she can fully 100% communicate with heart to heart. Even though she had family here, there was still that cultural difference no matter what, and it really was just difficult to understand. But because I was becoming more aware of things outside of myself, I started to really see the value in owning my Korean identity and, you know, being part of my culture, because it's not just being able to speak a language or not. It really affected me at a much more personal level, because I realized that if I'm not able to speak Korean, if I'm not able to have a sense of Korean culture, I'm gonna have this distance from my mom as well, and I didn't want that. I just got tired of this distance and this detachment. Just looking back, I wish I was just more secure of myself so I could just be part of it, because, you know, being distant from your culture, it really is a lonely feeling. And so at this point, because I was really by myself and I had nothing to lose, I wanted to immerse myself more in the Korean culture, because I didn't want my mom to feel so lonely, and for myself, I didn't want to feel detached anymore. And at this point, social media was becoming a bigger thing. You know, I had the internet. I finally had these resources around me that I was like, I think it's time to just own it and just immerse myself more, because I really had nothing to lose. I would only be able to gain this part of me that I was always kind of afraid to gain and kind of always far from. Even if people might not think I'm a Korean, even if I'm not able to communicate with other Koreans or relate to them, no matter what, it's still 100% a part of me. My entire family is from Korea. Even though I was born in America, it's still 100% part of me. Even if other people don't think so, it's still who I am. And that kind of just took too long for me to realize. Sorry, my camera died. But anyway, there was just nothing stopping me from finally being immersed in my culture. I was 19 and I became much more aware of myself and all that I just didn't want to be ashamed anymore of trying to be myself. You know, obviously growing up, I may have, you know, developed slowly. I may have not been able to personally relate with other Koreans, but that was when I was younger, and I can't let that affect my life anymore. So from then on, I decided to finally start learning Korean, because I finally had the internet. I had resources to finally teach myself Korean, but also an important part of me finally being proud of my Korean identity was definitely K-pop. My parents have always exposed me to K-pop. You know, I grew up with Big Bang and Girls' Generation. I knew about K-pop since I was a kid, but there wasn't really the stan culture of K-pop in high school. Obviously things have changed and K-pop is a huge thing now, but when I was in high school, even though it wasn't really that long ago, there wasn't that kind of culture, so I wasn't able to, you know, really be immersed in K-pop. And actually, my mom introduced me to BTS, which was my first K-pop group that I really started standing. My mom actually introduced me to them because it was the Billboard Music Awards and my mom was talking about BTS getting the nomination and all that, and I was like, huh, K-pop, cool. And then I just, for some reason, I wanted to check them out. And then it changed my life. But because of that, it was kind of this gateway into Korean culture. I started watching more Korean dramas, listening to more Korean artists in general, just finally being able to find stuff to relate to with my mom. My mom was always watching these Korean dramas and all that, and I never knew what she was watching or talking about. And now I actually understood, and it kind of just felt nice that I was able to finally relate to my mom in some kind of sense. Obviously, K-pop's not the epitome of Korean culture, but it definitely is a part of it, and it helped me kind of be more exposed to whatever my mom cared about. And I'm very much in love with all of it, and it definitely shaped me to become the person I am today. For the last year and a half, I've been learning Korean, and I'm definitely better. I still have a slight insecurity about it, just because growing up, you know, I used to get teased for trying to speak Korean, that kind of stuff. I'm not perfect. There's still that underlying insecurity, oh, if I speak Korean, it's gonna be embarrassing. So even though I don't speak Korean all the time, you know, I speak it with my mom and I speak it with my dad sometimes, but I'm definitely able to understand it more. Now I'm actually able to speak to my grandma, my dad's mom, in Korean because we always spoke in English to her and we never bothered to try to speak in Korean to her. In my first few months that I was learning Korean, I surprised her by suddenly starting to speak Korean, and she was so surprised. She was so happy and really appreciative that I was actually learning Korean, and it was really just such a nice experience. I want to be able to make my family's life easier because even though we're all in America, it wouldn't kill me to speak in Korean with them and just make their lives a little bit easier. But that is really my experience so far growing up Korean American. I was very much afraid to be connected to that side of me because I always felt like I wasn't enough and I felt like I couldn't relate to other people. This doesn't just have to do with being Korean American. This applies to anyone who is a child of immigrant parents coming to a country where, you know, you're not the dominant people. It can be very difficult to know who you are because you may not feel confident enough to own your ethnical background, but you obviously physically don't fit in with everyone else, and it's just really weird and hard, and it really can affect you negatively. But there's really just nothing wrong with identifying as the ethnicity that you really are. I only gained more by identifying with this part of me. Like, there was nothing that I lost from it. This journey so far of learning is just so eye-opening and rewarding. I still obviously don't always 100% feel Korean. It's still, you know, it's still hard for me to blend in with the Korean community, especially at my school. There's a huge Korean community, but, you know, obviously there are some differences. But now I'm just not taking it so personally because, oh well. And also lately in Korea, they've been styling their hair to kind of make it wavy, and it kind of just makes me feel both happy but also triggered at the same time because I always used to be so ashamed. Not ashamed, but like I used to, you know, kind of be sad that my hair wasn't straight. But, you know, now people are appreciating different hair styles, and so that's nice, I guess. But now it's just, I'm not afraid to be in touch with my Korean side. There's nothing wrong with identifying as my ethnicity. That was my experience growing up as Korean American, and honestly, the past 20 years have been a lot, but it's been a lot of growth, and there's just a lot more for me to learn, and it's just a nice journey, and it's a lot of fun. I hope that you guys can also, if you're also dealing with something like this, you can not be afraid to be in touch with your ethnicity, even if people don't think you're enough. Who cares? This is my background. This is who I am. I'm going to do as much as I can on my part to learn about my ethnicity and own my nationality as well. People should learn more than one language, honestly. The world is so interesting and people are trying their best, so people should learn more. I hope this video was interesting and eye-opening and wholesome. I don't know. Let me know your upbringing, your story. Let me hear it. I want to hear it. That is all I need to say. I am emotionally tired. That is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. We are going to end it with a hug, and I hope that in your journey of knowing yourself, don't care about what other people think about you. Just own your own identity and just do the best that you can, okay? That is it for this video. Goodbye, my friends. I will see you next time.